Tainted Grail is the best modern game release I have played since Baldur's Gate 3. A 50-person team in Poland has managed to outcompete every other major AAA open-world game that has released in the last 2.5 years. In addition to that, they managed to solve my biggest issue with FromSoft combat in a non-Souls-like game with one of the most genius game design decisions I have seen in years. I want you to buy Tainted Grail because I would be absolutely crushed if this game does not perform well enough to receive DLC or a sequel, but I also must inform you that the game is not finished. Although it almost never crashes, it does have loads of audio and quest bugs, and Act 3 is not at all at the standard of quality of Acts 1 and 2. Fortunately, almost all of the content in Act 3 is optional, so you can always replay Acts 1 and 2 and then end the game shortly after, and whoever decided to make Act 3 skippable is a genius and saved the replayability factor of this game. You are going to hear a lot more negative criticisms of Tainted Grail in this video than were in other game reviews, but it's also probably true that I like Tainted Grail more than a lot of those other reviewers, and when you truly love something, you will inevitably become its biggest critic because you want it to reach its true potential. The developers at Awakened Realms did send me early access to play this game during the review period. At first I thought this was a mistake. I have rated every single open world game that I have covered a 5 or lower over the last 2.5 years. If I was the marketing manager for an open world game, I wouldn't give me access to a review code. Who in their right mind would send early access of an unfinished open world game to one of the biggest open world haters on YouTube? The answer is someone who is confident that they made a good game. They knew that they could send this game to someone who hates quantity over quality bloated design and that they would still enjoy the game. Act 2 of Tainted Grail was one of the best exploration experiences that I have had in gaming, only being rivaled by Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3. The first act of Tainted Grail is still very good, but it's not quite at the same level, and we'll talk about Act 3 later. There's something interesting to find in every corner of this game's first 2 acts. I'll walk up to some random NPC and they'll give me a quest to find the bandit who has been stealing supplies from the warehouse. I walk in at night to catch the thief in the act, only to find a portal to another dimension. Naturally, I jump right inside and discover the last warehouse guard who has become trapped in this world. Now I have to venture further inside of this warped dimension to uncover the secret behind its existence, which I won't spoil here, and I won't spoil any other big side quests in this video. The point of this explanation is to give you a taste for the kind of wacky, crazy adventures you'll stumble upon while exploring in Tainted Grail. Talking to a random NPC might just cause you to enter an alternate dimension or join a weird cult. Awakened Realms unironically put more effort into an underwater mermaid death sex slideshow than Bethesda put into the evil ending of Shattered Space. The second act of this game is a genuine masterpiece in terms of the combat, level design, open world design, quest design, and visuals. It really is the ideal free roam game, and if you at all liked the early access of Act 1, the second act should blow you away. Although this isn't the most graphically intense game, and many of the 3D models do look dated, I am telling you that at points this game feels like a spiritual experience to walk through. A lot of it comes down to how the visuals mesh with the music. I can't play the music right now since most of it is copyrighted, but amazing cello-heavy orchestra music that feels both somberful and magical plays while you look over the most majestic scenery, and every act has slightly different music to set the mood. Act 3 is emptier than the first 2, but even with that being said, the act's atmosphere is impeccable. Trekking through the harsh, snowy mountains while an amazing soundtrack plays and you look at the sun over the horizon, it really does feel spiritual in nature. There's no other way to explain it. You have to experience it for yourself. It is now time for me to do the customary washed up game critic thing where I compare the game to Dark Souls for an uncomfortable amount of time. time, but I need you to understand that I am comparing it to Dark Souls 1 specifically for a very important reason. It's not because the combat is like Dark Souls, it's because it's the evolution of slow Souls combat. In some ways, this game's combat picks up what FromSoft left behind in Dark Souls 1. In the introduction, I said this game fixed my biggest issue with FromSoft combat, so now it's time I explain what that is. When you played your first Souls-like, it was this scary, immersive experience where danger was creeping around every corner, and then you figure out that if you just abuse backstabs and dodge roll iframes, you can use skill to turn into an invincible god. You can do a level 1 run to try to recapture that original feeling of danger, but that just results in you getting so good that now the world has no threat at all. In other words, the feeling of danger in FromSoft combat is disposable once it becomes solved. Use your invincible shield of iframes at the right time and win. FromSoft still tries to challenge players despite the system being solved with tons of ambushes and delayed attacks and fast attacks, and they give you the necessary stamina to dodge roll spam to deal with this, but this has caused them to leave behind the magic of slow Souls combat where every action had weight and felt like it mattered. Tainted Grail asks a very important question. What if instead of making combat hard by making the enemies stronger, we make the player weaker? This brings me to my favorite design decision in Tainted Grail. Instead of looking towards the dodge roll as the solution, they looked at it as the problem. Not only does dodging drain stamina, but it also drains a stack at the bottom left of the screen that varies from 2 to 4 depending on your build. And once you run out of stacks, your dodges become shorter and lose iframes until the cooldown period expires. This is so genius. You still have the joy of landing a good dodge against a boss or an enemy, but you have lost your invincible shield of iframes. And even though the cooldown period is short after you upgrade it, losing a dodge can get you killed very quickly since enemy damage is so high in this game. Tainted Grail turns the dodge into just another resource that goes on cooldown, so if you get overwhelmed by too many high-leveled enemies, there may be no answer to win. You might run out of dodges, get your stamina broken, and die. Or maybe you can invent a positioning strategy to scrape together a win despite your low level. The dodge roll limit also means that the combat becomes much more positioning based, kind of like in Dark Souls 1. You have to plan your entries and escapes from combat. When you only have 3 or 4 dodges, every dodge has this extra feeling of importance. Where am I going? Where is the dodge going to leave me? Will this dodge place me in a bad position that will result in my death? Usually when games mix stat-based and skill-based combat together, the result is terrible, but I think this is the first game that does it well. I like that combat takes skill, but I also can't just beat every encounter at level 1 after I solve the combat system, which is ironic considering that one video series I made, but whatever. Making the dodge a resource ensures that combat against normal enemies survives repeat playthroughs in a way that Souls games can't do after you solve them, because combat is always difficult against strong enemies until Act 3, but we'll get to that later. This game does a great job of making the combat fun regardless of your build choice. Most enemies in the game have both ranged and melee attacks to challenge all builds, and melee attackers rush so quickly that ranged characters will be engaged in combat. They also made shield gameplay more engaging, as you can parry attacks by blocking at the last second, which is kind of like deflecting in Sekiro, but it's almost impossible to parry attacks if you don't stat for it, so I don't have any footage of that to show you. I'll probably do a second playthrough where I focus on shield combat. Another great thing about this game is the skill tree. I love the CRPG Warhammer Rogue Trader, but I hated leveling in that game. You have to scroll through around 100 talents where 80% of them suck to find a few good ones, and it's so boring that I just end up defaulting to using a leveling guide. In Tainted Grail, it is super easy to find great stuff for your build. Go to a tree you're interested in, and you'll immediately immediately find great skills to look forward to. They also give you the perfect amount of skill points, just enough so that everyone can multi-class, but not so much that you can complete a class super quickly like in Skyrim. I will say that certain abilities are poorly balanced, especially in the end game. There's one end game ability that makes your slowdown ultimate attack deal double damage, and another one that adds 50% on top of that. Both of these should be taken out and replaced with dealing an extra 1/3 of damage or something around there to not break combat. The skill that lets you slow down time while dodging is also busted, and it basically ruins every 1v1 if you choose to use it since you can't get hit. They should either reduce the slowdown time by a lot or get rid of the skill. I will say that I do have one major criticism of this game's combat. Although I love the combat mechanics themselves, they decided to include unlimited Skyrim pause menu healing with no difficulty option to turn it off. In the first half of the game, you won't have too many potions unless you hard grind alchemy, so it's less of a big deal. But after the halfway point, you have too much healing power to be challenged unless you choose not to heal. And I did choose not to heal sometimes just because I liked learning some of the encounters. But I would also prefer a structured difficulty mode that provides a challenge for me. Also, one boss rewards the player with 10 full health, full mana heal potions, which was a bit too much. 1 or 2 would have been fine. Right now, the game has a survival mode that restricts saving to bonfires and beds. I love this as an idea, and I think there should be an additional challenge mode that restricts healing items. Maybe the developers or a modder could add a pouch system where you start with 4 potion or food slots, and you can increase the pouch through completing main story or side quests, and by the end of the game you can have 8 to 10 potion slots. They could also add a drink animation that causes the player to only have access to a gimp dodge roll like when they're casting spells to make healing more of a challenge. The enemies do have to drink potions to heal, so I don't see why the player doesn't as well. I also think that some of the larger dungeons might need an extra bonfire or bed checkpoint thrown around to make the larger dungeons feel fair in survival mode, but some dungeons already have beds in them, so this is dungeon dependent. My final piece of advice is that survival mode should not be locked to just hard mode, because the game is already way too hard. Survival mode should just change the game's checkpoint and healing systems, and the difficulty of the enemies should be adjusted separately, because I died over 100 times in normal mode with manual saves, so I couldn't imagine hard mode without any manual saves. If these additions were made, then Tainted Grail would have more of that Dark Souls 1 surviving a dangerous world feeling that I crave, and adding these difficulty options wouldn't come at the cost of other people's enjoyment since they could just leave them turned off. If Awaken Studios don't add these options, I really hope that modders do it, because I want to replay this game on a more extreme playthrough that is really forcing me to use all of the mechanics, because the combat mechanics are really good. It's just that the game doesn't always force you to interact with them. On the topic of difficulty, this game's first 2 acts are very hard. Like very, very hard if you don't hard grind potions and level up a lot and grind a bit. As you all know, I am extremely stubborn and I refuse to lower the difficulty to easy, even though Galahad and his knights took me like 2 hours to beat. But I definitely think that you shouldn't be afraid to lower the difficulty, since some of the difficulty bumps are kind of insane. At points, easy mode felt more like normal mode. Another option the developers should patch in is New Game Plus. Right now the game just sort of ends with no option to continue or start a new playthrough, and people who like to carry forward progress on one character for a long time should have that option. Another thing to talk about is the level design in dungeons. This game starts with a giant prison dungeon that is really well designed and interconnected. It also has 1 boss and 2 mini-bosses who both have cutscenes. This tutorial is so fun and somewhat challenging that I think I'll look forward to it on repeat playthroughs. It made me wonder if this game would have tons of great levels like this one, but unfortunately there aren't too many. Most dungeons are lighthearted and short, with either a short quest or boss at the end. They are all handcrafted and pretty looking, but they usually aren't too long. I didn't find any super large interconnected dungeons in Act 1 after the prison. Maybe the closest thing is like a drug operation dungeon, but then the story of Act 2 leads to two very large interconnected labyrinths, which I won't show too much of here, but they're both amazing and the highlight of the game, and I want you to see them for yourself. And then Act 3 is supposed to have a large endgame dungeon, but since it's unfinished, it didn't end up being well designed. You basically fight the same 2 or 3 enemy types a few times, and then you get to the end, and there isn't much intelligent design. Fortunately, a lot of the world design feels like a dungeon, especially in Act 2. Act 2 also has an extra big mid-sized dungeon that was interconnected. In general, Act 2 is just really good. Although I'd prefer them to make more well-designed interconnected levels, I am happy that the big dungeons we do have are great. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the story without any spoilers. While Bethesda games tend to make you the Chosen One right away, this game instead opts to put the Chosen One inside of your head. The spirit of King Arthur possesses you, and you need to reclaim every piece of his lost soul that was spread across various artifacts that once belonged to him. Some characters hate King Arthur and want you to collect every piece to murder him, while others want you to resurrect him so that he can bring order to Camelot and Avalon. King Arthur himself doesn't understand why others hate him so much because he has amnesia until every piece of his soul is reunited, so you discover both the good and the evil of Arthur's reign alongside him. It is an interesting concept for a game, although sometimes I wish there were a few more interactions between the main factions in the story and Arthur. Act 1 does this the best since a Knight of the Round Table is involved, but then Acts 2 and 3 feel more separated from the core conflict with Camelot. Overall, I did like the story, and it had a creative plot twist towards the end that I really enjoyed. What might be the best part of the story is the environmental art. You'll often find yourself in extraordinarily beautiful, mystical worlds. Just absolutely jaw-dropping stuff. Okay, enough with the glazing. Back to mean critic Feeble King, the one you all know and hate. This game is not finished. Some audio lines start to cut out in Act 2. And let's talk about Act 3. It's absolutely beautiful, but it fails in every other way. A ton of quests are bugged, side quests won't finish, quest markers that won't update, and a major quest line with the Berserker tribe will break if you pick up the matron insignia before you reach the village and start the quest, which cost me about 40 minutes of progress. The main quest in Act 3 has a few interesting moments, but overall it's way too fetch questy, and it never sends you to any lengthy, interesting dungeons like in Act 2. The tribe quests also just drag on and take way too long to complete. As mentioned before, these somewhat boring quests are skippable, and thank God for that. What might be the worst part of Act 3 is the exploration and enemy variety. The developers ran out of money, so they just copy and pasted a ton of reskinned enemies from Acts 1 and 2 everywhere, and they didn't scale them up to your level, so they're all very easy to defeat despite the fact that you have several broken endgame abilities. The developers also decided to make a ton of the enemies undead, and they might be the most boring enemy type in the game. They're slow health sponges that usually lack ranged attacks. There's a few good combat encounters in Act 3 where they'll randomly throw 3 mini-bosses at you at the same time, which was the highlight of the act, but this is rare. The enemies in general don't deal any damage in this act, so you can just hit trade everything to death with your stockpile of potions and lifesteal, while in Act 2 everything two-shots you. The game really loses its edge in Act 3. You can put the game into hard mode, but that doesn't fix the issue. This just turns the enemies into bigger health sponges, and they were already kind of mechanically boring. If they were gonna throw a bunch of copy-pasted enemies at me, I'd far prefer it if I was able to fight the Doom Eternal laser eyeball enemies, since they are super fun. They have multiple ranged attacks and melee combos and are aggressive, and in general this enemy type is everything right with the combat system. I want more enemies like these mixed in with melee enemies to make combat fun, which they did in Act 2 but not in Act 3. Also, for some reason, hold to cast spells just don't work. My lifesteal and damage would just sometimes stop for no reason. Another glitchy issue is that some of the cutscenes would end up lagging behind the audio, specifically the cutscenes you get at the end of each act. Act 3 also has a ton of dungeons that just don't go anywhere. You aren't running into amazing side quests left and right. You also don't find much good loot. I didn't really find anything better than what I already had for my build. While in Act 2, I found amazing loot and was rewarded very well. Most Act 3 dungeons are very short, have a few undead, maybe a reskinned boss, then it's over. So it starts to feel more like Skyrim, I guess, just fighting Draugr enemies over and over again. So yeah, it's kind of a bummer that one of the best games I've played in years didn't have the funding to get finished, and I'd still recommend it over any other AAA open world game that I've played in the last few years, including Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. I didn't review that game, but I played it, and I thought, yeah, it's a bit overrated. I didn't hate it, but I do prefer this game. I also think that Act 2 of this game is just a masterpiece. It's just one of the best slices of content that I have experienced in a game. I don't game as much as I used to because a lot of the new games that come out are just kind of bad, but I feel myself compelled to play through Tainted Grail again because it does have that it factor. When the game is good, it's good in every domain, from the combat to the enemy variety to the writing to the side quests, the music, and the visuals. It was just all amazing. At first, I was very confused with the unfinished state of Tainted Grail. Why would a developer rush towards a May release in between Expedition 33 and Elden Ring DLC, when it could be delayed to a less busy summer season and then they would have more time for development? I am genuinely worried that this game's release time might cause it to get buried, which would be terrible. The only answer I can think of as to why they had to rush the release is because the studio is about to completely run out of money. This game started as a passion project using leftover money from a board game Kickstarter that did a little bit too well, and it turned into the most creative gaming achievement that I have experienced in many years. If gamers don't buy this game and support the indie studio because they're playing Expedition 33 and Elden Ring, then I'm scared that the studio might shut down and all the potential from this new genre of game will be lost. I will be heartbroken if that happens. The most important thing to me in gaming is finding new creative sparks like this amongst the mediocrity. I haven't wanted to talk about a modern game release on this channel in almost 2 years. That has to mean something. I really want them to finish up Act 3 and release DLC. I am looking forward to what this studio makes next more than almost any other studio in the industry right now. If Mario Kart is worth $80 to $90, Acts 1 and 2 of Tainted Grail is easily worth $45, and it took me around 45 to 50 hours to complete the first 2 acts alone, although I did make sure to explore almost every nook and cranny of Act 2. If you like Skyrim or Dark Souls 1 combat, I think you'll find something to like about this game, even if it's rough around the edges and unfinished. But then again, Dark Souls 1 was also unfinished at release, and so was Fallout New Vegas and tons of great games. I'm still heartbroken that Fallout New Vegas never got a sequel, and I don't want Tainted Grail to go down in history as lost potential because there is so much potential here.